Chapter 4. Medieval Aristotelianism. In addition to the mendicant movement and Petrarchan humanism, another development decisive for the course of art was medieval Aristotelianism. The philosophical context of early Renaissance art was the recent incorporation of Aristotle into Christian theology, most notably by St. Thomas Aquinas. If the building material from which Leon Battista Alberti constructed his theory of painting was Ciceronian rhetoric, Aristotelian metaphysics was the foundation. In the opening lines of De Pictura, Alberti remarks that mathematicians may consider the form of things apart from matter, but, since we wish the object to be seen, we will use a more sensate wisdom. Aristotelianism can certainly be called a philosophy of sensate wisdom, since one premise which distinguishes it is that all knowledge begins in the senses. The name of Aristotle's metaphysics, which means after physics, and was assigned by an anonymous medieval cleric, is fortuitously expressive of Aristotle's procedure of reasoning from the sensible to the abstract. The study of visible things precedes the study of all that is unseen, as one comes to knowledge of the human soul from the movements of the body, and of God from the movement of his creation. The Aristotelian presupposes that form is immanent in matter, and so he digs like an archaeologist by excavating the archi, the origin, the matter from which things are made, in search of unity, goodness, beauty, and truth, the telos or end to which all things go. The Renaissance artist followed the same procedure. He would begin with the evidence of his senses, by drawing from the live model and even dissecting cadavers in order to abstract out the form of the body. As a humanist who shared Petrarch's disparaging opinion of scholastic pedantry, Alberti does not cite scholastic sources in De Pictura. And in fairness, neither Aristotle nor Aquinas had very much to say about the painter's craft. Some historians have inferred from Alberti's silence that he was a nominalist strongly opposed to Thomism, though this opinion is indefensible. Through the popular medium of Dante's poetry, as well as the preaching of Dominicans, Thomism enjoyed an authoritative status in Renaissance Florence. The cultural tone was set by the Dominican church of Santa Maria Novella, whose facade Alberti himself designed, and the Dominican monastery of San Marco. Seminal works of Florentine art were commissioned by the order, and the greatest artist of Alberti's generation was a Dominican, the beloved Fra Angelico. Alberti's theory of painting proceeds from the philosophical premises of classical realism, consisting of a synthesis of Plato and Aristotle, to which the later academic tradition firmly adhered. It was the scholastics who achieved this synthesis by incorporating the new Aristotelianism into an older Platonism, which had been integral to Catholic theology ever since the days of St. Augustine. Classical realism is essentially the belief that things have a nature which can be known. This sounds very simple, and it is, though it is deduced from more complicated premises, beginning with the Platonic doctrine of the forms, that what is ultimately real is not the material world, but an eternal and transcendent realm of pure form, and that the expression of the eternal forms in matter brings created things into being, with the implication that particular things have a universal nature. Aristotle adapted Plato's view by claiming that form only exists together with matter in particular things, such that the material world is not estranged from reality, but fully real in itself and intelligible to us through reason. Classical realism, as formulated by St. Thomas Aquinas, combines both ideas, the reality of the material world as conceived by Aristotle, as well as the existence of universal forms as conceived by Plato, reinterpreted as immaterial essences which exist both as ideas in the mind of God and within the physical world. On the terms of classical realism, contingent beings are composed of essence and existence. The union of form and matter reduces an immaterial essence to existence in a primary substance, as when, for example, the union of body and soul gives concrete existence to human nature in a particular human being. Aquinas fully accepted the ontological framework of Platonism, that the created world is an icon of God and an emanation from him, even as he embraced Aristotle's hylomorphism, concerning the reality of the body and the intelligibility of the material world. Aquinas believed that things have a universal nature, which can be known by abstracting it out from the particular. Nominalism is the opposing view adopted by later theologians and philosophers that universals are not real but mere names for categorizing particulars. Immanuel Kant, for example, claimed that what we perceive to be the nature of things is only a nominal essence which does not exist objectively outside of thought, and that the true nature of things lies beyond the limits of reason. This being the philosophical crux of postmodernism, the postmodern art world has stridently rejected Thomistic essentialism, although an implicit belief in immaterial essences is still manifest in the operation of the art market. One might point to the concern for authenticity in a work of art. Prior to the 14th century, few works were ever signed by an artist, but during the Renaissance this began to change. Artists who took pride in their work wanted credit for it, and the difference between the hand of a master and that of an imitator soon became important to collectors as well. Even today, everyone will take for granted that an autograph original by Rembrandt is much more valuable than any forgery, though this is not self-evident. In the Dark Ages, originality had no bearing on the merits of an icon as an instrument of worship, and in antiquity, fine Roman copies of Greek sculptures were apparently valued as much as the originals. Yet, no museum would ever deign to display a copy of an old master painting made by a contemporary artist, as if such a thing could possibly rival its model. Even the most technically astute reproduction could not replace the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum's long-lost painting of the Storm on the Sea of Galilee, painted in 1633 by Rembrandt. This attitude, derived from and analogous to the attitude of the faithful toward a holy relic, is based on an implicit belief in essentialism, that the artworks of a master share an immaterial essence, which is the basis of their value, and which copies and forgeries lack. Despite a postmodern campaign to rid art of the criterion of authenticity, the art market has retained the premises of Thomistic essentialism in a postmodern age, which purports not to believe in them. No matter how convincing a 19th century forgery of a Rembrandt might be, the forgery will still lose all market value should it be found out, because it is lacking something essential: the hand of the master, the efficient cause of a Rembrandt. Even if a forgery were to perfectly replicate the formal cause of a Rembrandt by capturing the master's style, a challenging but not an impossible feat, the forgery will lose all market value should it be discovered that anachronistic pigments have been used, such that the artwork lacks the material cause of a Rembrandt. Of those paintings that are autograph originals by Rembrandt, their market value will also vary considerably according to their artistic quality. Just as there is a difference between first, second, and third-class relics, there is a distinction to be made between artworks which express the same immaterial essence to different degrees of perfection. The most valuable masterpiece is the one that most beautifully imitates nature in the style of the master, beauty being the final cause not only of a Rembrandt, but of fine art in general. Being by the hand of Rembrandt, of materials that Rembrandt is known to have used in the form of Rembrandt's style and more or less beautiful, the works of Rembrandt van Rijn have a specific nature which can be known. They all share an essence which is immaterial, and each has a substantial form which reduces that essence to existence in varying degrees of perfection. The stylistic difference between Byzantine and Renaissance art is essentially the difference between the Platonic realism of the Dark Ages and the Aristotelian realism of the High Middle Ages. Fine art shows what things really are. A Platonic art form will accomplish this by depicting only the essence of things. On the terms of Christian Platonism, according to which God's idea of a thing is more real than the thing itself, it makes perfect sense to capture only defining characteristics using the simplified and idealized forms of Byzantine iconography. Since man's essence as a rational soul is readily expressed in a painting without paying much attention to the anatomy or individuality of the human body, Platonism inclined artists simply to memorize stock forms from medieval pattern books. Aristotelianism motivated the stylistic shift toward naturalism as it became apparent that what things really are is not just an ideal form arrived at by reasoning in the abstract. A human being is not just an interchangeable instance of human nature, nor is he just a rational soul, but a rational animal, a unique composition of body and soul. What is really real is substantial form, a particular expression of the essence of things, from which it follows that artists should attend to the appearance of things by studying nature directly. Although an essence may exist as an idea in the mind of God, it is still only a lifeless and ethereal abstraction until it is expressed in matter. To capture the union of form and matter demands close attention to specific natural kinds as well as to the particularity of each individual, form being a principle of differentiation which separates one kind from another, and matter a principle of individuation which distinguishes particulars. This imperative surely motivated Dante's preoccupation with historical particulars in the Divine Comedy, and it made Leonardo da Vinci's dissection of the body necessary, since the universal traits of the species had to be discovered by abstracting them out from the particular. Aristotelianism separated not only Renaissance art but also Gothic art from the art of the Dark Ages, as the artist's idea of form could not continue to stagnate once it began to be refreshed and refined by drawing from life. Even after the craft traditions of painting and sculpture had accumulated a nearly inexhaustible pattern book of sound precedent, life study would remain the unwavering rule of art. Already by the early to mid-1400s, Gothic painting arrived at an astonishing degree of naturalism in the works of Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, whose fidelity to appearances was scarcely ever surpassed by the Italians. Artists of the Florentine Renaissance instead preferred to strike a golden mean between naturalism and idealization. In pursuit of substantial form, Italian artists strove to grasp rational principles of form, which make things what they are, as well as material idiosyncrasies which individuate them. By the turn of the 16th century, the direct observation in which Netherlandish painting had excelled in Alberti's time was perfected in Italian painting by rational principles of linear perspective, chiaroscuro, and anatomical construction. Just as the truth expressed by the scholastics was a synthesis of Plato and Aristotle, the truth of art advanced by the Florentine Renaissance was an elusive union of appearances and the ideal, paralleled in Dante's seamless amalgamation of history and mythology in the Divine Comedy. Citing the cautionary tale of the ancient painter Demetrius, who fell short of the mark because he paid more attention to appearances than to the ideal, Alberti advises in De Pictura that one emulate Zeuxis, who captured the beautiful Helen of Troy by selecting the best features of 5 different women. A painter should not essentialize deformity by slavishly copying appearances, but imitate nature judiciously, in view of an idea of beauty, lest one succumb to Plato's critique of the soullessness of mimesis. In Plato's Republic, Socrates disparages the imitation of nature as a mere copy of a copy and a soulless imitation of appearances, 2 full steps removed from the ultimate reality of the form of the good. Socrates regards the potential deceitfulness of the mimetic arts as so dangerous that they should be strictly regulated, and commends the unalterable conventions of Egyptian art for being free of the decadent innovations abounding in the art of classical Greece, and rather more attentive to geometry than to nature. Fortunately, the tradition of painting which proceeded from the Renaissance never stagnated and petrified in the way that Egyptian art did, but continued to be innovative thanks to a dialectical tension which kept the tradition in motion. From the synthesis of Plato and Aristotle, there arose a polarity between more idealizing styles and more naturalistic styles, which turned to conflict under the influence of modern philosophical schools. While the academies maintained the necessity of idealizing nature, outside of the academies there was a tendency towards styles suggestive of William of Occam's nominalism, that universals are not real but mere names for categorizing particulars, such that the painting most faithful to appearances to the exclusion of the ideal should be considered the most realistic. A bad taste for the disfigured and the ugly was always characteristic of German painters such as Lucas Cranach, and in the 17th century even the Italians were carried away by the bald and gritty naturalism of Caravaggio. Giovanni Bellori took care to express his disapproval of Caravaggio's style, because nominalism could never be countenanced by the academic tradition. He could not condone a style of painting which upended the metaphysical priority of form over matter and of reason over the senses. This philosophical divide persisted for centuries, until the end of the 19th century. The battle caricatured in a cartoon by Honoré Daumier between French realists and idealists was the penultimate in a long war of rebellion, which also included the battle of colorists and classicists in the 17th century. The subordination of color to drawing was defended on the authority of Aristotle, who asserts in the Poetics that the most beautiful colors are of less merit than a clear outline, because they do not express form. According to Aristotle, real beauty, as opposed to the superficial sensory pleasures of bright colors and sweet flavors, depends on magnitude and order, qualities whereby beauty addresses the rational soul. Even though nominalism was anathema to the academies, highly naturalistic styles such as Caravaggio's were defensible and even preferred in the 19th century, provided there was no gratuitous disfiguration or ugliness, since there was another solution to the soullessness of mimesis besides idealization, a solution which was emphasized by Renaissance theorists and derived from Aristotle. If form and matter, body and soul, subsist together in one substance in hylomorphic union, i.e., if the human body is not a tomb in which the immortal soul is imprisoned, as Plato supposed, and the separation of the soul from the body is not a liberation but the rending apart of one's being, then an artist has only to express the soulfulness which is manifest in the body to answer Plato's charge of the soullessness of mimesis. As Ludwig Wittgenstein comments in the Philosophical Investigations, anyone who wants to know what a soul looks like need only look to the human body. The question is, what is it that makes the body look soulful? Aquinas writes, "The soul is defined as the first principle of life of those things which live, for we call living things animate, i.e. having a soul, and those things which have no life, inanimate. Now life is shown principally by two actions, knowledge and movement. Hence, the soul is expressed in art by depicting the animation of the body, with lively facial expressions and gestures. The best way to paint the soul is to paint the body in lively, expressive action and to eschew the cadaverous stillness of rigid oriental symmetries. The end of human nature being a way of living, the proper object of an artist's imitation is human action, as Aristotle writes in the Poetics. The soul is not a mysterious homunculus located in the pineal gland, as René Descartes believed, but denotes the divided nature of the body as a lump of matter of a strangely active and self-organizing kind. If one sees the behavior of a living thing, to quote Ludwig Wittgenstein, one sees its soul. Léon Baptiste Alberti therefore enjoins the history painter to depict the movements of the soul manifest in the movements of the human body. Quote, "The history painting will move the soul of the beholder when each man painted there clearly shows the movement of his own soul. It happens in nature that nothing more than herself is found capable of things like herself. We weep with the weeping, laugh with the laughing, and grieve with the grieving. These movements of the soul are made known by the movement of the body." History painting rightly stands atop the hierarchy of genres because it is the paradigmatic solution to the soullessness of mimesis, while still life rightly sits at the bottom, being paradigmatic of the problem. The very name still life, or natura morta, dead nature, as still life is called in Italian, was frankly meant to underscore the motionlessness and even soullessness of such things as silverware, crystal goblets, plucked flowers, fruit, and wild game. This hierarchical distinction did not have the effect of suppressing less exalted genres, but actually enabled them to flourish by showing the way up Parnassus. The history painter's depiction of lively action in the most straightforward sense inspired still life painters to transcend the cadaverous stillness of their subject matter by alluding indirectly to the action of men and setting their crockery in motion. The classical hierarchy was logical and just, and it was contested nonetheless by the enemies of the academies, since those who did not believe in universal forms or general essences did not see the force of Plato's critique or the need to answer it. A painting of any genre can express movement to answer the charge of soullessness, because a painting has a soul all its own by which it springs to life, a substantial form which makes it what it is and sets its parts in motion. Created things differ from merely manufactured things in that they have a substantial existence lacking in tools and machines. Most things that are man-made have only an accidental form, which is reducible to parts whose nature does not depend on their participation in the whole. Remove a tire from a car, and it will not cease to be a tire, but remove a hand from a body, as Aristotle said, and it will cease to be a hand, except equivocally. A work of art likewise possesses an organic unity and an inner teleology, which make it irreducible to its parts. The parts of a painting are like so many notes in a musical composition, which would become meaningless apart from their integral relation to the whole. No excellence was more highly esteemed during the Italian Renaissance by connoisseurs of painting and sculpture than movement, though not just any movement will do, as the movement of the soul is toward its final end, as opposed to the random, chaotic motion of a splatter painting. The movement of the soul is a coming into being, and thus ordered to the transcendental ends of being, of unity, goodness, and truth. A human being needs body parts, and not just any parts will do. One needs all the organs and bones and muscles proper to a human being. The substantial form of a human being is the order of the whole organism. This includes the order of all one's biological systems, and all the parts of all the systems, and all the parts of all the parts. Yet, substantial form is not just the plan of a thing, as if the soul were reducible to Vesalius's anatomical diagrams. It is also the source of all the operations of the whole. Substantial form determines one's development from conception to maturity. It drives one on to an optimal state of flourishing. The movement of the human soul begins in the division of a fertilized egg and culminates in the corporeal integrity of a fully grown body with many members acting together as one, unity, each duly proportioned, goodness, and in its characteristic form, truth. A painting works the same way. The soulfulness of a painting is manifest in its integrity, proportion, and clarity, which is of course Aquinas's definition of beauty. Since beauty is essentially the revelation of being, each of the properties of beauty reveals one of the properties of being. To make a painting beautiful is the necessary and sufficient answer to Plato's critique of the soullessness of mimesis. A beautiful painting is a living organism in motion toward its final end. The evocation of movement is a paradox, since a painting is painted on a two-dimensional surface which does not move. A poetic invention unfolds in the interval between a beginning and an end, but in a painted invention there is no such interval of time. What movement a painting has arises instead in the conceptual interval between a material substrate of paint and a form which is beautiful and true to nature. For all the time spent making a painting, even the greatest masterpiece takes at most a lingering moment to see, yet there arises from its static marks a movement from signifier to signified, as if a temporal gap were somehow pried open. Form and matter visibly differ, even as they coincide in one substance. Is that paint, one ponders with a quizzical glance, or is it a hand? Is that an eye, or a brush stroke? Hiding behind the mask of naturalism, the paint comes forward all the more as itself. No matter how highly finished a painting may be, or how assiduously the brushstrokes are hidden, the transformation of paint into a figure in three-dimensional space is never resolved but forever frozen at its climax. The signifier can never be completely effaced by the signified. Like the body, a painting is a lump of matter of a strangely active and self-organizing kind, which differs from itself within itself. A beautiful painting has a soul of its own, manifest in the movement of paint into a beautiful form. A painting's beauty is thus in the expression of its own coming into being, which accounts for the virtue of painterliness. The traces of the performance in a painting might be characterized as a technical narrative, arising between the lines of a literal narrative, every mark a twist in a gripping tale of the act of artistic creation. Technique is something of a hieroglyphic script, since only a painter really knows how to decipher it. In theory, the process of painting is completely straightforward. You mix paint on a palette and put it on a canvas. Anyone can imagine doing so, yet most viewers cannot infer much about how a Rembrandt was made by looking at it. This is a terrible privation, though the point of writing in hieroglyphs is not necessarily to give away the story, but to evoke a mystery. Were the technique too obvious, there would be nothing evocative about it. An exposed brushstroke lying naked on the surface of a canvas is intoxicating only to an eye which has never seen one before. Something has to be hidden. In the difference between one brushstroke and another, each intelligently layered and differentiated according to divisions of form. In every such division, one stroke comes forward and another recedes, evincing a play of surface and depth. The literal depth of a properly layered oil painting evokes a metaphorical depth of things unseen which give form to what is seen. A common and eminently practical definition of beauty is unified variety. Just as matter comes to life when joined to something immaterial, a beautiful image comes alive through the frictionless and harmonious play of opposites, such as symmetry and asymmetry, which together create compositional movement. Even though the mere imitation of appearances is soulless and a merely idealized image is a dead image, the union of the two breathes life. Likewise, the opposition of light and shadow is what creates an effect of light, and the contrast of cool colors and warm colors in complementary harmony creates a sense of balance. Materially, a painting is only so many colors on a panel or a canvas, but when color and drawing enter into harmonious play like a body and a soul, that surface is transformed into infinite space. Such opposites are not conflicting, but mutually supportive, their union an intimate strife from which a third term proceeds. Just as a primary substance proceeds from the union of form and matter, a child proceeds from matrimonial union, and the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son. By the same logic, the beauty in a work of art proceeds from the play of its oppositions. A living image is never mechanically symmetrical, nor does it look like it was made by a machine, with a deathly precision or accuracy. Its detail is not indifferent, flat, photographic detail, which abstracts the surface of things from the thing itself. As Jonathan Richardson writes in his Essay on the Theory of Painting, published in 1715, it takes as much insight as sight to capture a convincing simulacrum of life. A portrait painter must understand mankind and enter into their characters and express their minds as well as their faces. As Richardson explains, painting not only shows us how things appear, but tells us what they are. Who a person really is all too easily disappears behind a catalog of facial features. Who has not had the uncanny experience, especially as one grows older, of finding a photograph of oneself to be strangely unrecognizable? A portrait may be accurate in every detail and yet bear no resemblance to the subject for want of life. The body is intelligible insofar as each part is subordinate to the whole. To show what things really are, the painter must subordinate each and every moribund detail to the living whole. Roger de Pile termed this le tout ensemble, the all-together. He maintained that each part of a painting should be rendered to the precise degree of contrast, detail, and volume proper to its role in the composition, which is facilitated by rendering an oil painting gradually in stages. The French academic painter Paul Delaroche was justly criticized by Charles Baudelaire for instead rendering each form in his oil paintings to a finish one by one, as though he were painting in fresco, with the effect of sacrificing a degree of coloristic unity for the sake of a heightened naturalism. To recap, we have established that what a human being is, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, is a composition of body and soul, and that Renaissance painters expressed this by capturing an elusive union of appearances and the ideal, which gave rise to a spectrum of both idealizing and naturalistic styles. We have established that the union of body and soul is the definition of life, and so to paint this union is to paint life, manifest in the movements of the body. We have established that beauty is the basic solution to the soullessness of mimesis, that beauty might be defined in terms of integrity, proportion, and clarity, as it was by Aquinas, and that beauty can also be understood for practical purposes in terms of the harmonious play of opposites, most notably the play of design and color. Design and color never came into conflict in Renaissance painting, as they later did in the French Academy, because prior to the Protestant Reformation, Renaissance artists still had the luxury of taking for granted the harmonious, unconflicted view of reality handed down to them from the High Middle Ages. Even after Italian painters of the Cinquecento found themselves divided into opposing schools, The highest aspiration, as noted already, was to unite the classical idealism of Florentine disegno with the comparatively supple naturalism of Venetian colorito, by combining the very best drawing with the best coloring, for which reason Jacopo Tintoretto incised across the wall of his studio the words colorito di Tiziano, disegno di Michelangelo, the color of Titian, the drawing of Michelangelo. Although Renaissance art's intellectual pedigree in the scholastic synthesis is only implicit in treatises on painting, it is attested quite explicitly by Raphael in the Stanza della Segnatura in the Vatican, where on one wall the intellectual heroes of Christianity face those of classical antiquity on the other, not as antagonists but as fellow laborers in the pursuit of truth, the best of both pagan and Christian thought having become one. Plato and Aristotle are depicted standing side by side, Plato pointing to the heavens and Aristotle gesturing to the earth, as Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism had also become one. These two paintings, arguably Raphael's greatest masterpieces, are nothing other than a celebration of the synthesis achieved by St. Thomas Aquinas and his peers, who were unprejudiced followers of all the greatest minds. Although the name which has been given to the disputation of the sacrament rather obscures what the painting is about. The given name is problematic because there is no dispute about the Blessed Sacrament. No theologian approved of by the Church has ever questioned transubstantiation, the real presence of our Lord in the Holy Eucharist having always been taught by the universal ordinary magisterium and formally defined in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. Certainly, no one represented in Raphael's fresco was a heretic, although there is an ancient pagan. Aristotle appears prominently in this fresco, as well as in the School of Athens, a testament to his importance to Catholic theology, as well as to Renaissance art. Since the two frescoes are known to have been inspired by Petrarch's triumphs, written between 1351 and 1374, a paean in honor of such things as love and chastity, these two paintings might more accurately be entitled Triumphs of Philosophy and Theology, as implied by the allegorical figures of philosophy and theology on the ceiling above them. Raphael's Parnassus in the same room is likewise a triumph of poetry. The design of Raphael's Disputation evokes images of the chain of being, a Neoplatonic representation of the hierarchical ordering of nature closely related to the doctrine of analogia entis, the analogy of being, which was the crux of the scholastic synthesis of Platonic transcendence and Aristotelian immanence. The doctrine was confirmed in 1215 by the teaching of the Fourth Lateran Council that one cannot note any similarity between creator and creature, however great, without being compelled to note an even greater dissimilarity between them. God is totally other than creation, even as he utterly subsumes it as the ground of its being. God is both transcendent and immanent, as that being in whom and through whom all things have their being. All creatures, writes St. Thomas, are like God as the first and universal principle of all being. The analogy of being proposes that there are not two kinds of existence, one proper to God and another proper to creatures, but one existence predicated of God in which creatures participate by analogy to a greater or lesser degree. Being is participatory and hierarchical. In the great chain of being posited by the Neoplatonists, all creatures are ordered according to their proximity to the divine nature. The closer one's proximity to God, the greater is one's dignity. As rational animals, human beings fall between the brute animals and the angels, and we are blessed with the occasion to transcend our human nature, as Dante says in Canto 1 of the Paradiso, and ascend the hierarchy through the order of grace. The closer a being is to God in the order of nature, the more fully one participates in existence, and the higher one ascends in the order of grace by becoming a saint, the more one's share in existence may grow. The seraphim being the highest choir of angels because their nature most faithfully imitates the divine nature, one may infer by analogy that the seraphic form of art is the most faithful and beautiful imitation of nature, exemplified by classical art. By using classical art forms in the service of the Catholic Church to retell the story of creation and of our redemption, Renaissance artists baptized the tradition of pagan art, just as the scholastics had baptized the tradition of pagan philosophy. Renaissance art was the perfect pictorial counterpart to what the scholastics had accomplished in philosophy and theology. Disagreements between Franciscan and Dominican theologians concerning the doctrine of analogy, to say nothing of voluntarism, threatened the unity of medieval thought, though this unity was not seriously upset until the Protestant Reformation. There is a misconception popularized by historians such as Will Durant that the Florentine Renaissance was a neo-pagan revolution against the scholastic synthesis and based on Neoplatonism, but not Aristotelianism, much less Christian theology. This is almost entirely untrue. The Council of Florence, which began in Basel but was reconvened in Florence between 1439 and 1445, did bring to Italy representatives from all the Eastern churches along with their libraries. A trove of classical Greek texts was reintroduced to the West, including many of Plato's dialogues and the Enneads of Plotinus, which were translated by Marsilio Ficino into Latin. Ficino's protege, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, has become well known for his oration on the dignity of man, published in 1486, which has been called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, and which originally introduced his 900 Theses, which were condemned by Pope Innocent VIII. Pico's oration peddles a Pelagian version of self-transcendence, as if human freedom consisted in the ability to assume an angelic nature and arrive at union with God by pulling oneself up the chain of being through philosophical contemplation, magic, and Kabbalistic spiritual practices. Thanks to the Pope's prompt intervention, Pico's oration was not widely read until the 20th century. Pico was subsequently reconciled to the Church under Pope Alexander VI and became a devoted follower of Savonarola, whose orthodoxy was unimpeachable. Savonarola's fulminations against the pagan morals of Renaissance Florence, particularly its sins against nature, lend credence to Will Durant's portrayal of the Florentine Renaissance, but Savonarola's existence and popularity also belie that portrayal. The leading lights of Renaissance Florence, including the young Michelangelo and even the Medici, whom Savonarola relentlessly attacked as usurers and tyrants, revered Savonarola, and many of them venerated him after his untimely death. What influence Ficino's translations exerted over Renaissance art is difficult to say, because the primary sources betray little of this influence, but Plotinus merits some attention. Among ancient philosophers, Plotinus was the only defender of mimesis as it relates specifically to painting and sculpture. Although Aristotle's vindication of poetic imitation was readily transferred to other arts, Aristotle had essentially nothing to say about painting or sculpture. Plotinus had a great deal to say about them, and he made his defense of mimesis on terms somewhat different from Aristotle's. "The arts are not to be slighted," wrote Plotinus in a retort to Plato, "on the ground that they create by imitating natural objects." The deity himself being a demiurgos, a divine craftsman who creates by imitation according to Plato, the imitator of nature follows a divine prototype, and even enters into competition with the divinity by improving upon nature where nature is lacking. Art is analogous to the logos, by which the natural world has been created and from which its beauty derives. As Plotinus explains in a discourse on spiritual beauty, imagine two blocks of stone, one roughly hewn and another fashioned by a master sculptor into the image of a god. The statue will obviously be the more beautiful of the two in virtue of the form or idea introduced by the art. Plotinus continues, "This form is not in the material, it is in the designer before it ever enters the stone by his participation in his art. The beauty, therefore, exists in a far higher state in the art, for it does not come over integrally into the work. That original beauty is not transferred. What comes over is a derivative and a minor beauty, and even that shows itself upon the statues not integrally and with entire realization of intention, but only in so far as it has subdued the resistance of the material." We are told by his biographer Porphyry that Plotinus seemed rather ashamed of being in a body, since he conceived of matter as an evil and the body as an impediment to the movements of the soul. Yet Plotinus did not prefer idealism in art to naturalism. "Why is a living ugly thing more attractive than the sculptured handsome thing?" asks Plotinus, to which he replies that the former has a soul. The work of art participates in the logos from a greater distance than the living soul, being of a later origin. Art is an imitator, producing dim and feeble copies. Since the living thing is more attractive than the artificial thing, the most living portraits are the most beautiful, even though the other happen to be more symmetric. His solution to Plato's critique of the soullessness of mimesis is thus the same as the solution derived from Aristotle to express the animation of the body, which may be an indication of his influence on the Italian Renaissance. Another indication of Plotinus's influence is that artists found their prototype in the divine act of creation. Aquinas compared the act of creation to the arts, saying, "All natural things were produced by the divine art, and so may be called God's works of art." But Aquinas did not apply the term creatio to what human artisans do, it not being ex nihilo. Human arts introduce new forms into existing materials, which is a process of change but not creation out of nothing. Human beings can only be secondary causes, acting on what God has created. So much is inarguable, though it may be objected that the fine arts are strikingly analogous to creatio ex nihilo, if not univocally identical. Just as nothingness is transformed under God's knowing gaze into the pure potentiality of prime matter, or the waters over which the Spirit broods in Genesis, so too a roughly hewn piece of marble is transformed into a potential sculpture under the eye of a sculptor seeing what it could become. Just as non-being becomes an object and is thus already created when beheld by the divine subject, even before any form has been imposed or any actual existence has been given, an artwork begins to be created when first beheld by a human subject in the mind's eye. In relation to God, non-being is turned into an abyss of infinite potential, and in relation to a human being, material things are turned into a quasi-infinite array of possibilities. St. Thomas writes, "To create is, properly speaking, to cause or produce the being of things." Is this not what an artist does by producing a work of fine art? An artist gives the work of art existence, and every time one beholds the work of art, the viewer participates in sustaining it in existence. As a thing of beauty, whose final end is to be beautiful, a painting languishes in a state of potentiality when it is unseen, but every time someone beholds it and sees that it is good, its creation is completed all over again. Recognizing a fellow artist in God their creator, Renaissance painters self-consciously imitated the original separation of light from darkness by painting in chiaroscuro, and the separation of the heavens from the earth by drawing an horizon line in linear perspective. And they made images and likenesses of themselves quite literally from the dust of the earth by using the earth colors of a traditional palette. The nature of the divine act of creation and man's role in it were of paramount importance to artists and humanists of the Renaissance. It is suggestive that after the fiasco of Pico della Mirandola's 900 Theses, the only writing which he published during his lifetime was a commentary on the first 26 verses of Genesis, the Heptaplus, while his oration had similarly begun with reflections based on Genesis and Plato's Timaeus. Pico's particular interest in these sources reflected a general ethos. Plato's Timaeus had never ceased to be read in Latin translation and was held in the highest esteem, which is why Plato holds a copy of it in Raphael's School of Athens. In the Timaeus, reality is subdivided into two realms of being and becoming, as if to split the difference between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Plato's divine craftsman unites the two realms through the union of form and matter. The ideal forms provide a model for the demiurge to imitate, while matter constitutes the clay. The form-matter distinction is a teleological one, meaning it is proper to things that are made to serve a purpose, such as a jug or a hammer. Only in things made for a definite purpose does form determine the selection and arrangement of matter, and yet one does not speak of the production of jugs and hammers as creation. The act of creation is proper to works of fine art, which transcend the utility implied by the form-matter distinction. The work of fine art is made to serve a purpose which it contains within itself. It glorifies its creator by simply being what it is. Plato's demiurge is not a 19th century manufacturer, imposing a mechanical design on raw materials to serve some extrinsic purpose, but brings all of creation into being for its own sake in an act of beneficence, since he is sufficient unto himself and has no need of anything. Most things that are man-made disappear in the performance of their function. no conscious notice is taken of them unless their function is impeded. The work of art announces its existence and therefore the fact of its creation. The words factum est are inscribed on every created thing. In the Dark Ages, images were rarely more than conceptual equipment, a tool like a hammer or a jug, their purpose to make abstract doctrines concrete. In the High Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, artists began to make art for its own sake in imitation of the divine act of creation. Gothic and Renaissance art imitated the gratuity and variety of creation, as described by Aquinas, for he brought things into being in order that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And because his goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, he produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is simple and uniform, in creatures is manifold and divided, and hence the whole universe together participates the divine goodness more perfectly, and represents it better than any single creature whatever. Even when delimited by the demands of the liturgy, Renaissance artists always went above and beyond to create works which exceeded and at times transgressed what was required liturgically, artworks which are no less at home in a picture gallery. Sacred images from earlier times and traditions are estranged from their native context when placed in a museum, which does violence to their true nature by turning them into objets d'art, but not Renaissance art. The latter was made to hang in a museum no less than a church, as it frankly blurred the distinction between aesthetic and mystical contemplation. Critics of the Italian Renaissance would say that it insidiously blurred the distinction between nature and grace, and between this world and the next, as sacred images invaded secular spaces and profane images invaded sacred spaces. The story of creation, as told in Genesis, confirms the gratuity of creation as an act of beneficence, though Genesis is much more poetically expressed than Plato's Timaeus. In lieu of form and matter, the biblical author speaks of water and wind, namely the spirit which hovered over the deep. The Hebrew Bible is free of the corruption of philosophical abstraction, so much so that it is almost surprising to find in the Gospel of John a conflation of the Socratic logos with the words spoken in Genesis by which the world is made. Like a human artisan, Plato's demiurge cannot do what he strives to do, to cancel the very difference between form and matter in a perfect synthesis. In no single case has nature made anything perfect and finished in every part, writes Cicero in De Inventione. In the Cours de Peinture par Principe, Roger de Pile similarly laments the impossibility of painting the perfect truth, which is composed of both the simple and the ideal truth. Raphael, he claims, came closest to the mark, but even Raphael could not paint a perfect synthesis. Likewise, Plato's demiurge is powerless to impose his perfect image on a material world subject to growth and decay. Entombed in corruptible flesh, the immortal soul finds itself in a state of privation, its passage into bodily existence a journey into exile from perfection, from which there is no homecoming except in death. The God of Genesis knows no comparable handicap. What God creates is good, and therefore wholly without defect. While the demiurge of the Timaeus is merely a craftsman, the God of Genesis creates by fiat. He says, "Let there be light," and there is light. His creation is spoken into being out of nothing. While Genesis is a temporal account of creation unfolding in the course of a week, the Timaeus is spatial, being negotiated between a material realm and a realm of ideal forms. God's creation in Genesis is analytic, proceeding by the differentiation of one kind from another. The craft of Plato's demiurge is synthetic, as an integration of form and matter. The two accounts are perfectly opposed, and therefore perfectly complementary. In much the same way that Sir Isaac Newton's fundamental theorem of calculus relates differentiation to integration, and Albert Einstein's general relativity ingeniously relates space to time, the Gospel of John expresses a quintessentially ingenious idea by implicitly relating Plato's Timaeus to Genesis. At the pinnacle of creation, God condescends to become a craftsman like the Platonic demiurge when he forms man from the dust of the earth. As God says, "Let us make man to our image and likeness." Adam is not created by divine fiat, presumably because in order to bear the divine image, Adam has to give his fiat. To become like God, Adam has to become a creator. He has to become a participant in the work of creation as the cause of himself, by using his rational intellect and his free will. Adam and Eve accomplish this together by naming the animals and tending the garden, and so becoming poets and artists, though that is not all they must do. Man is obliged to complete what God has begun in him by making a voluntary sacrifice of his will, as this is what God requires of every rational creature to merit the beatific vision according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Adam must pronounce the words of the Pater Noster, fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And yet when Eve is tempted, she makes a fatal choice and Adam falls with her. By failing to make the proper sacrifice or to worship God rightly in fulfillment of their nature as free, rational creatures, Adam and Eve are sent into exile and death. Cut off from the tree of life, the grace which gives life to the soul, as the soul gives life to the body. Human beings in the state of original sin have a nature which we cannot fulfill and seek a happiness which we cannot have. Even before the fall of Adam, there are hints in Genesis that all is not right with the world. As God first beholds his creation, nowhere does he say that the work of the second day, the separation of the waters above from the waters below, which is the separation of heaven from earth, is good. Before God can rest or judge his creation to be good, its estrangement must be healed by a mediator, which is what Adam is created to be. Adam is tasked with bringing heaven to earth by willing that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and then tending the garden. By preferring his own will to God's, Adam instead exacerbates the estrangement that he was created to heal, necessitating a new Adam to complete the work of creation in a new creation. Transposed onto a Christian context, the classical nude inevitably became a representation of prelapsarian innocence, and it inevitably anticipated a fall reminiscent of Adam's, away from Catholic faith and morals. The gratuitous use of the classical nude in a liturgical context was first met with complacency, as an image of the human body restored by grace to its first innocence, and then with skepticism as it fell under suspicion of impurity, partly due to the scandalous behavior of prominent artists. Thanks to slanderous stories invented by Giorgio Vasari, Raphael acquired a posthumous reputation for having been a womanizer, and his studio assistants Giulio Romano and Marcantonio Raimondi even produced a collection of obscene prints set to ribald poetry by Pietro Aretino, for which Raimondi was duly imprisoned by Pope Clement VII, and Aretino was exiled from the city of Rome. From the dizzying heights of Michelangelo's ceiling and Raphael's stanze, commissioned by Julius II, Renaissance art fell in the course of just a few years into the hands of pornographers. The first modern historian of the Renaissance, Jakob Burckhardt, was keen to characterize it as the beginning of the modern world and as an era of secularization, which had already begun to fall away from the Catholic faith. This is not true, but there was moral decadence, and Petrarchan humanism also opened the floodgates to an ocean of bizarre, heterodox theological ideas, as humanists began to discover the full spectrum of pagan philosophy as well as Islamic and rabbinic sources. Confident in the unity of truth and having no inkling of the danger posed especially by rabbinic mysticism, humanists syncretized Christian doctrine with the most incompatible pagan ideas. The aforementioned Marsilio Ficino and Pico, as well as the humanists Nicolaus Cusanus and Lorenzo Valla, were all heralded in the 19th century as proto-modern thinkers, Cusanus being identified as a precursor of German idealism, and Valla as a forefather of modern biblical criticism. For having demonstrated the fraudulence of the donation of Constantine, Valla was even described by St. Robert Bellarmine as Luther's precursor. Niccolò Machiavelli also deserves to be mentioned as the forefather of modern political philosophy. Uniquely among his peers, Machiavelli was an atheist, and The Prince, published in 1532, is easily the most impious product of Renaissance thought. Nevertheless, the preoccupation with the spiritual life in the poetry of Dante and Petrarch, and the pious nature of the great majority of Renaissance art demonstrate that the spirit of the Italian Renaissance was far from secularizing. While humanists can unfortunately be accused of tilling the soil of the Protestant Reformation, Renaissance art's aestheticization, its tacit blurring of nature and grace, and its appropriation of pagan subjects tending toward obscenity were at worst a few of the myriad indirect causes of the Reformation. The silver lining of the Reformation is that it was followed by the glorious renewal of the Church in the Counter-Reformation, and the lingering suspicion of Renaissance art was put to rest by the art of the Baroque, made in the service of the Counter-Reformation. What makes for a great tragedy is that you can't tell whether the reversal of fortune is for better or for worse, as Kurt Vonnegut liked to say. Though evil in itself, the fall of man was providential in that it set the stage for the collision of heaven and earth in the Incarnation. Man's sin became an occasion for God to imprint his perfect image on matter by becoming a man. When the Virgin gave her fiat and the Word was made flesh, her womb became the new Eden of a new creation. When Jesus gave his fiat during the agony in the garden and thereby reversed the sin of Adam, he completed the new creation of man. That is why Pilate was inspired to utter the words Ecce homo, behold the man, and at least partly what was meant when our Lord pronounced as he hung naked on the cross, it is finished. The day of the crucifixion was the sixth day on which man was recreated, and the day after, following Christ's entombment, was the seventh day on which God rested. The Church's approbation of Michelangelo's art, notwithstanding the emendations made to the Last Judgment, compels one to conclude that the nudity of classical art was legitimately appropriated by Renaissance artists to signify what Christ has accomplished to reopen the gates of paradise. The use of the nude, even in a liturgical context, was not only fitting but positively willed by God as a providential symbol of the recovery of our lost innocence in the new creation. Truly, the art of Michelangelo was inspired by God, as Giorgio Vasari claimed. Renaissance art is inescapably identified with Catholicism, though rarely do devout Catholics think very highly of it. Suspicious of the Italian Renaissance, and reasoning by analogy to Pope St. Pius X's reform of church music, which greatly restricted the use of classical music in the Mass and confirmed the preeminent status of Gregorian chant, many traditionalists express a preference for primitivism. One prominent bishop has even expressed the desire to whitewash the Sistine ceiling. Traditional Catholics are generally in denial that the Church ever condoned the nudity in the Sistine ceiling, it being erroneously believed that the offending members were all covered up after the Council of Trent, and that John Paul II scandalously exposed them when the frescoes were cleaned. Such ambivalence about art is nothing new, but as old as the first chapter of Genesis. In describing the creation of man in God's image, the biblical author makes poetic use of synonyms, image and likeness, to introduce a dialectical tension. The word translated as image is the Hebrew tselem, which derives from a root meaning shadow and may denote anything that is insubstantial or transient. This suggests a negative view of images, as if akin to an idol, eidolon, similarly meaning phantom in Greek. In every image there is an absence where a beating heart should be, and idolatry is the worship of that absence. An image pretends to show us something other than ourselves, when in fact the image is only an estranged part of ourselves, as the work of human hands. To worship it is to worship man, which is to worship nothing, since man is nothing, not a god but only a shadow of God. The image embodies nothing more than the void within us. It cannot heal because it is a self-referential, deceitful illusion. Then the biblical author equivocates. Adam is also created in God's likeness, or demut in Hebrew. This evokes a more positive understanding of the image on the order of classical mimesis, as a thing resembling what it represents. The image in this sense is like a ferry or a bridge between the self and the other. The other is not truly present in the image, but the image nonetheless reminds one of the other. If tselem corresponds to eidolon, then demut corresponds to the Greek word eikon. Man was created in the likeness of God to mediate the divine essence by giving assurance of his invisible presence, as though seen through a window or in a mirror. The same ambivalence arises whenever the Bible speaks of the arts. The first example of human artistry subsequent to the fall is when Adam and Eve take leaves to cover themselves. One purpose of art is to hide the body's shame, shielding a sacred gaze from being polluted by the profane. As ornamentation, clothing acquires the dubious purpose of seduction by revealing what it should conceal. It is not incidental that the first artisans happen to be the God-forsaken children of Cain, who murdered his brother Abel. It is Cain who establishes the first city, and it is Cain's sons who invent musical instruments and the craft of metallurgy. In the apocryphal Book of Enoch, the arts are said to have been learned from fallen angels. This is only logical, given the universal association between metallurgy and the netherworld, and it is also paralleled in the classical tradition of the inspiration of the Muses. Plato's vivid description in the Phaedrus of theomania, the divine madness of an artist acting not by art or by knowledge but ecstatically, is transparently a description of demonic possession. Even the word genius originally denoted a literal spirit. Consistently characteristic of the fall, the arts come from morally dubious sources to serve morally dubious purposes, to conceal, to tempt, and to deceive. Under the Old Covenant, fine art came under severe regulation in view of its fallen nature, though not to suppress it but to purify and redeem it. When God gave Moses the law, he also gave him plans for the tabernacle and for the Ark of the Covenant, which were designed to redeem the artistic forms of paganism. Just like other ancient temples, the tabernacle and the subsequent temple in Jerusalem were made to separate the sacred from the profane, like the leaves which had covered Adam and Eve, and they were also ornamented to seduce the eye, revealing the magnificence of what was concealed therein. When Adam and Eve fell and found that they were naked, it was God himself who sacrificed an animal and gave them the skin to cover themselves in a foreshadowing of their future redemption, when men and women would be clothed in the righteousness of Christ, having sacrificed himself on their behalf. The mimetic image is soulless and dead, just like the skin of that dead animal. Yet, the lifeless mimetic image can still participate by analogy in the life of the one to whom it refers. God could never be satisfied by the sacrifice of sheep and goats under the Mosaic covenant, and yet he accepted them as an image of the more worthy sacrifice that would be made by his Son. Under the New Covenant, the redemption of art begun under the Old Covenant was completed with a definitive solution to the soullessness of mimesis, having everything to do with art's meaning. The frescoes of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel are unquestionably greater than any lost paintings from antiquity, not merely on account of their formal qualities, but because of what they mean. Ancient images of fictitious pagan gods are soulless and dead, but when those same forms are used to represent Christ or the saints in the context of the liturgy, they partake of the life of Christ and the saints. Renaissance art, regenerated as it is by its proximity to the liturgy, has an entirely different spirit than the art of classical antiquity, despite its formal similarity. Primitive art is acceptable in the context of the liturgy because it is just as capable as classical art of bearing the requisite meaning needed for sacramental purposes. God himself has shown a special favor for the most humble kind of art, as miracles have been associated with any number of primitive images, such as Our Lady of Good Counsel, which it is said was miraculously transported to Italy from a church in Albania to save the image from destruction by the Turks. I am unaware of any painting made by a Renaissance or Baroque artist to which anything miraculous has been attributed. In the order of grace, the most humble art forms have been uplifted to a status they could not merit in themselves. Yet in the order of nature, most of the medieval painting and sculpture which preceded the Italian Renaissance is obviously inferior to the art that followed. Just as there is a great chain of being, there is a hierarchy of art based on art's nature and purpose. Fine art is not just a conceptual tool, nor is its purpose merely to make abstract ideas concrete. All art is essentially an imitation of nature, and its end is beauty. Hence, the most beautiful imitation of nature is naturally the best. It is fitting that the sacred spaces of the Eternal City are largely adorned with the art and architecture of the Renaissance and the Baroque, rather than Gothic or Byzantine art, because the traditions of Renaissance art are quintessentially Roman Catholic. So much so that to despise or to denigrate this art is proximate to despising and denigrating the Roman Catholic Church itself. The Church's artistic traditions are just as much a part of her as are her intellectual traditions, and Renaissance art is to Catholic art exactly what scholasticism is to Catholic theology, both consisting of a classical tradition adopted and baptized by the Church. When Giorgio Vasari spoke of the rinascita dell'arte, or the rebirth of art, he was after all alluding to a familiar passage in the Gospel of John. The Italian Renaissance was not meant to bring about the return of paganism, but to recover all that was redeemable in the classical world. The rationale for the Renaissance was Catholic, as well as Aristotelian.